discussions about some very crucial issues of the day, and we've got a packed programme today also with lots more goodies. So I won't detain you long at the moment, but like yesterday, a few things to mention, starting again with the very important job of thanking our conference sponsors. Headline sponsors Valpak and Bin Group, Recycling Technologies for the Speed Pitch Hub, and FCC Environment for the bursaries sponsorship. Many thanks, as ever, for your generosity. The usual housekeeping notes: if there's a fire alarm, you'll be directed to the rendezvous point. It will be a serious one if we hear one. There'll be more speed pitch sessions today in the upstairs area of the exhibition during the lunch break. Do go to that if you can. Have a look on your app for a list of talks. The event app, as ever, is a great tool. It's got speaker profiles, it's got all your session details, attendee lists, and much more. And during the plenary sessions, starting with the one that will follow our first two main speakers, you'll also be able to use it for asking questions. So if you've come today for the first time, haven't downloaded the app yet, please do. The details are on the screen, what you do, and Bob's your uncle. And remember also that after the event, all the speaker presentations will be on the app too, so you'll be able to study them afterwards and listen to any of these, or read any of these that you haven't been able to get to. Do turn your phones to silent, but feel free to tweet your feedback from the sessions and debate with fellow delegates. And the hashtag there, ScottRes19. Time to get started. I'm delighted to hand over to Bruce Reekie, Chair of CIWM Scotland, to open day 2 of the conference formally. Bruce.
Thank you, Sally, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scottish Resources Conference here in the fair city of Perth. And I have the pleasure of opening day 2 of the conference. As you'll be aware, the conference is a partnership of CIWM, Zero Waste Scotland and SEPA to bring together the resource management professionals from across the industry to engage, debate and discuss. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for their generous support and for our speakers over both days for their willingness to share their time and their expertise. For its part, CIWM is a leading professional body for resource waste management professionals. It's the voice of the sector and represents around about 5,500 individuals and organisations. In Scotland, the CIWM Centre Council is made up of voluntary members, supported by Gail Martin, our Membership Development Executive. Gail's involvement and that involvement of the Centre Councillors allows us to reflect your views and issues, not only through this conference, but through the various events that we hold throughout the year. And if you wish to speak to us and learn a bit more about CIWM and the conference, please find us at the reception desk, where we'll be more than happy to speak to you. In terms of the actual conference, I don't intend to review day 1, but what I did want to comment on was to say that, based on what we heard yesterday, we are entering a further period of significant policy change and uncertainty in terms of the national context. However, those policy outcomes can only be achieved by the type of engagement that we went through and we heard yesterday. But that engagement, discussion and active listening should not be confined just to this forum. Those discussions need to continue and happen throughout the year, and really should assist in developing, delivering and forming our policy outcomes. The answers to a number of the issues raised yesterday sit within this room, and it's our job to help provide a platform where you can meet, debate, distill and discuss ideas which are woven into workable policy instruments. And a great example of this was the session on developing joint industry guidance on the misclassification of waste and how to avoid it. The session brought together the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, Scottish Environment Services Association, Resource Management Association Scotland, and was chaired by CIWM. And given that it was at 5:30 when it finished, it was quite an achievement that they managed to make EWC codes sound interesting, particularly at that time of night, and given that there was drink available outside. I'm immensely proud to be part of this industry, which has proved itself to be highly flexible, adaptable and resilient in the face of a changing policy agenda. The latest challenges at home and abroad, such as the landfill ban, leaving the EU and the war on plastics, will be covered in a resilience session at the end of today, and I would encourage you to stay on for what will be an engaging and informative session. I look forward to your participation throughout the day and look forward to meeting as many of you as possible at the dinner and awards ceremony this evening. It just leaves me to say, have an engaging, enjoyable and informative day, and I'll hand you back over to Sally, who will guide us through the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Our first speaker this morning is Mike Webster, Chief Executive of the NGO WasteAid UK. Voted by his peers as the waste and resources sector top influencer in 2018. Mike's worked for more than 17 years in the waste and secondary resource sector with frontline experience of planning, development and delivery of effective waste and recycling systems, both in the UK and internationally. In 2017, he co-authored Making Waste Work, a toolkit for community waste management in lower and middle income countries. So please welcome him now, Mike Webster.
Hello everyone, I'm Mike from WasteAid and it is fantastic to be here. Apologies if I'm slightly bleary-eyed. I stepped off the sleeper at 5:30, and which actually was a pretty restful experience, but 5:30 was still pretty early to get up. So I thought long and hard about what to talk to you folk about. You know, what has always struck me in my, I think it's probably 18 or 19 years now I've been in the sector. I try not to update that biog too much because it slightly depresses me. You know, it shows me I'm getting old, but it is the kind of relentless pace of change. I mean, it's just been, you know, the rate of change in policy, the rate of change in behaviour change, what people are up for and ready for. Just seeing yesterday what Boris Johnson's aide did when he was caught carrying a disposable cup, I think kind of shows us quite how public attitudes have changed. The changes in technology, it's relentless, and so there's always that element of novelty, but I'm a slightly reactionary soul, so I thought actually, I think it's worth remembering quite what we do and why we do it, and just kind of the basics, because I think sometimes we just slightly take it for granted. I know the public do. So, yeah, I thought I'd talk about a forgotten topic, so just to remind us quite how important and fundamentally important what we do is. So just bear with me. I'm just going to go off on a bit of a tangent first of all, whilst I can consider the humble yeast cell, okay? The yeast cells, they flourish in a sugary environment, often produced by barley or grapes, and as they grow and they metabolize sugar, they produce that magical, stroke infamous on your, depending on your attitude, ingredient alcohol and carbon dioxide. And people all over the world have harnessed that approach for the brewing process, and we get a nice fizzy drink with a nice kick to it, and that's great for relaxing of an evening or celebrating. But let's just step back for a second. Let's just look at things from the yeast cell's point of view. Stay with me, don't worry guys. So most beer and wine is about 10 to 15%, and the reason it reaches that maximum is because actually, beyond that concentration, whilst we enjoy it, that material, the carbon dioxide, the alcohol, actually kills the yeast cell. So if we just think about it, the yeast cell is actually killed by the waste product. And actually, as humans, we're not that different. When the concentration of waste, which is human solid around us, gets too high, we sicken, essentially. And what we as resource managers do is, first of all, get that stuff out of harm's way, and then secondly, try our best to turn it into something useful. And I think it's just worth remembering that because we're living in a world with an awful lot of waste. Ooh, are you going to work for me? Where do I point? Oh, I was... Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry, I was told to pick up the one to the right. Never mind. So, anyway, Hey, right. So I'll just. Is there a different clicker somewhere? No. Oh, this clicker. Sorry, two different ones. I do apologise. So yeah, uncollected waste. Why does it matter? Well, first of all, what happens to it? It blocks drains and watercourses. Now, this is my most retweeted image ever. It's a bit rubbish picture, actually, because the police were kind of trying to ask why I was taking a picture, and I was sitting there with my phone kind of trying to take it at the time. What happens to waste if it's not picked up? It blocks drains and watercourses. That leads to waterborne disease, causes infectious disease. And what do you do if it's not picked up? Well, you stick it in the corner of your yard and you set light to it. Okay, and that matters. And there's a direct link. And what's really struck me as I've kind of done more of the WasteAid work of the time is the direct link between health and waste collection. And I'm talking about a matter of weeks. So, some examples. In Kinshasa in the Congo, there was a collection in 9 of the 24 communes of Kinshasa, and within those places where this comprehensive waste collection was put in place, funded by the EU, they did the whole lot. They had little NGOs, street cleaning, they had waste transfer sites, they had vehicles taking the material to the country's first ever sanitary landfill. They saw a 50 to 70% drop in waterborne disease. That's malaria, typhoid, cholera. Now, that's a city of 10 million people. So you're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives impacted just by getting the rubbish picked up. In Islamabad, in Pakistan, WasteAid has been working with Tear Fund to help them set up a big international NGO, help them set up community waste collections. And as soon as, within 3 weeks of a community, this one place called Saf Mahal in Islamabad, which was an informal community, informal settlement, didn't have waste collection. And within 3 weeks of actually an informal waste collection being set up, there was a 100% drop in medical bills. We saw it halve, essentially. Okay, in Bo in Sierra Leone, I was just having a conversation with someone last week. They said, yeah, we have set up a project in Bo, and as soon as the waste collection started, they saw a 50% drop in malaria. Why? Because the drains are now empty. They're not full of plastic. They're not full of rubbish. They don't get backed up. You don't get stagnant water. You don't get the mosquitoes breeding. And in Kwame here in Kenya, where we've got a community waste collection program at the moment, we saw within a month a 70% drop in gastroenteritis. As soon as we did community cleanups, again, keeping the streets clean, keeping the drains clean. And we kind of forget that because we've done that for such a long time in this country. And my colleague Zoe worked with Tear Fund at the beginning of this year, producing a report called No Time to Waste. I've got a copy here if you want to have a look. It's also on our website. And they estimate that every 30 seconds someone dies of a disease associated with poor waste management. So time and time and time again we see a huge link. And I think it was interesting. I had a look just kind of back at the historical records. And if you look back historically, it was exactly the same in Scotland. And in 1832, 3,000 people died in a cholera epidemic in Glasgow, directly linked to poor sanitation. Okay, not just solid waste, also the sewers and access to drinking water. But you can see, historically, there's a direct link between the health of populations and essentially get their rubbish picked up. And Edwin Chadwick, the pioneering social reformer, hero of mine, worked to bring in sewage and waste collections in cities across the country. And it really was civil society. It was people standing up and going, look, this is not on. We need to do something about this, that helped us get organised. We think that these sort of issues belong to the 19th century, the horror and challenges of rapid urbanisation, but we are now faced with a much, much, much bigger level of urbanisation across the world. We are now faced with what I think is the global industrial revolution. We now have more than half the world's population living in towns and cities. And waste management is a no-brainer, frankly, from a global development point of view. For every penny that you spend on waste, you get 10 pence back in benefits. So actually, I think it's a global development issue. You need decent solid waste management to develop your economy. And the scale of this, as I just mentioned, is now huge. So in 1970, there were 3 megacities, these kind of brown boxes. There was Tokyo, Osaka, and New York. That's cities of 10 million people or more. Now, by 2030, there are going to be 41 megacities in the world, 41 cities of 10 million people or more. 32 of them are going to be in developing countries, many places which do not have comprehensive waste collection. Okay, so the scale of urbanisation is huge. More than half the world's population now live in towns and cities. Okay, so don't forget quite how simple and basic and important, the job of getting the stuff out of harm's way is. okay? And the scale of it is huge. 3 billion people don't have controlled waste disposal. That means that places don't... This is an image of Bakote dump in the Gambia where we're working. This is not a landfill site, this is a dump site. Landfill sites have liners, they have fire control, they have cells, all of these sorts of things, leachate remediation, all of that lot. This has nothing. Okay, that is a dump site, and 3 billion people, almost half the world's population, don't have access to at least a sanitary landfill. And 2 billion within them don't have formal waste collection. Okay, so the scale of this is huge. So you might just think I'm kind of almost saying, we've got to collect the stuff, what next? I'm not an old school landfiller. I have to say, doing the WasteAid work, I have actually an increased respect for, you know, the importance of just a decent sanitary landfill sometimes. But getting collection off the street, getting the stuff off the street is key, but resource management is also key. And let's just think about the resource management side of it. So we know about the environmental reasons. You know, you guys know as well as I do, probably far better, you know, climate change, resource efficiency. We'll be thinking about marine plastics in a second. The importance of containing waste. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, you know, I've done this, worked in this sector for a while. I thought I didn't have a lot to learn. I watched The Secret Life of Landfill on BBC a few weeks ago, and it still shocked me. The impact of 70-year-old dump sites in the UK. There was one down by the Thames estuary still leaking in heavy metals, various chemicals, and that's 60 or 70 years old in the UK. Just think about the dump sites that are surrounding places like Lagos, Jakarta, Cairo. This issue is huge, and we're going to be dealing with this stuff for years to come. So anything that we can do to divert from a dump site is a win for a start. And to do that, we need to start thinking about how we can disincentivize this sort of thing. This is an image from, we're going to be setting up a big community recycling centre in Douala in Cameroon. And this is a tidal creek. This is not a dump site. This is a tidal creek. The sea comes in here twice a day and washes it out. Now, within here, this wouldn't have existed 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Why? Because many of the plastic containers, many of the beverage companies that you can see here, I'm not going to point, you know, be too blatant, but you can tell some of the brands that are there, they would have had glass deposit return schemes. Now, we've got to be honest, really, and those deposit return schemes, they provided a closed-loop system in parts of the world where there was no disposal system. So we've got to think, you know, you can sit there and argue the toss about deposit return schemes and EPR, I think, with perhaps a UK context or in a context of a country where most of the waste is collected. But from my mind, it's a no-brainer, frankly, in those parts of the world where the waste isn't collected. And now the private sector is amazing at operating in some very, very tricky parts of the world. I worked in the Democratic Republic of the Congo last year, and that in the east of the country has had an ongoing civil war for 20 or 30 odd years now. And even in the height of those civil war, you can still get a Primus beer, right, even in the most war-torn parts of that country. Now, the Primus Beer Company are amazing. They managed to get their bottles of beer into war zones, and they managed to get the empties out again, okay? So why can't we work with the private sector to make that happen, even in those parts of the world where the waste doesn't? And the government doesn't work so well. So DRS, I think, is absolutely important, absolutely vital and a no-brainer in those parts of the world where waste is not collected. Making value from waste is also vital because actually that's essentially WasteAid's model. This is just an image from our project in the Gambia where all of these slabs are, the ones on the left have got about 200 plastic bags in there. The tiles here have got about 100 each. And why does that work? Because it creates value from the materials. What's really important, you know, we're interested in creating those value, and we've about 500,000 plastic bags are being recycled every month just by this one project. We've got 90 people trained there. And each of the groups, there's groups of about 30 each, are making about £1,000 a month each. Between 30 of them, okay, that's 30 quid a month. That might not seem like a huge amount, but actually the poverty level is, the absolute poverty level is about £1, £1.20 a day, if you look at World Bank stats. So helping people make essentially £1 a day extra, because they'll have other jobs and other sources of income as well, helps people get out of poverty. So obviously recycling is important because it creates that resource value. Finally, though, the other thing is that who are we working with? Now, what has always amazed me about our sector is the ability for it to work with marginalised groups. If we look across the world, the people that are either picking on dump sites, the people that are going door to door collecting materials, even sometimes the people that we bring into the sector in this country, if we look at the community reuse and recycling sector, we work with often people that other sectors of society wouldn't work with. Perhaps it's ex-offenders, perhaps it's people with special educational needs. The opportunities and the ability of our sector to bring in people that perhaps don't have opportunity elsewhere is phenomenal. So what we do is crucial to global development. Okay, you've got many more interesting and frankly more important than people to listen to than me, but I'm just going to finally say to you, look, lift up your eyes and look around the world. There is so much waste out there, and we need you guys like never before. This issue is only going to get bigger. What is going on in this room and with all of the cutting edge thought and discussion is just the beginning. Essentially, we're the only thing, you're the only thing stopping the human race like those yeast cells poisoning themselves. And without you, our towns, cities and villages would quickly become uninhabitable. Now, because of what you do day in, day out, despite all of the stuff you guys put up with, despite the budget cuts, the terrible weather, the whinging public, unhelpful media and whatever on earth our politicians are going to chuck at us next, it's amazing. So I'd just like to say well done and give yourselves a round of applause. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Mike. Do you want to take a seat maybe along there, because we'll have a question and answer session after our next speaker. But if you've got any questions for Mike or any observations as a result of that, do start getting it into the app questions, or indeed you'll be able to put them to Mike later by a show of hands. It's salutary, I think, after hearing all that from Mike, to hear next from somebody who's seen up close the impact of waste and climate change and a number of the other destructive ways that we as human beings have chosen to live. Doug Allan, he who made an unscheduled appearance on the stage at the beginning of Mike's talk, he's an award-winning natural history photographer, documentary filmmaker and diver. He was principal cameraman on a plethora of prestigious programs, making more than 25 trips to the Antarctic and more than 30 across the Arctic, filming for series including Hostile Planet, Forces of Nature, Operation Iceberg, Frozen Planet, Ocean Giants, Human Planet, Life, Planet Earth, The Blue Planet, and Life in the Freezer. Sir David Attenborough reckons, as he's put it, that, quote, wildlife cameramen don't come much more special than Doug. If you have any thoughts or questions as he's speaking, do pop them in the app. I'll put them to him later, but for now, please welcome Doug Allan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sally. I'll just see if I can find the beginning of my show. Yes, this is so can you bring up, well, perfect, thank you. This is the kind of personal perspective of what I've seen and what I think should be done. Because as Sally said, I've been working in the poles since 1976. I've been filming since about 1984, and I've seen a lot of things. So this is, from where I stand and from where I swim, because I do a lot of underwater as well. This is me at work. I'm a freelance cameraman, and the equipment that we use now is much more sophisticated than it used to be, but the job has taken me to, some wonderful places. I do feel enormously privileged at what I have seen, the places that I've seen over the years. This is in Bolivia, the animals that I have been with. This is a Weddell seal with its pup underneath the ice in the Antarctic. It's not always standard animals that I work with. There are... real real hermit crabs, not quite real shells, but they were real shells. We built them from shells that hermit crabs had used. So I do all kinds of things. And as I say, I've also been very privileged to work and to see some spectacular pieces of animal behaviour. Now, when you see that kind of thing, you have to be amazed. You have to be amazed by the natural world. You know, those animals, think of the level of precision, intelligence, you know, that goes into that piece of animal behaviour. Some people ask me, you know, when you see that sort of thing happening, don't you feel sorry for the animals? And I have to say that no, I'm a cold-hearted bastard. And my attention is all about, is it in focus? Has I got the shots I want? Because this is a completely natural event. And my job as a filmmaker is to be there. A lot of people have made sure that I am there to possibly witness that. It's my job to film it. So I don't have any feelings. In fact, my priority is to not influence the outcome one way or another. It's sometimes the prey will escape, sometimes the predator will succeed. Sometimes you can have, you know, a rather macabre sense of humour. For example, as soon as I got this picture, I knew there was only one title for it, and that was Not So Happy Feet. But, you know, so, you know, I look on the natural world as a wonderful place, and I am a wonderfully privileged observer, whether it's watching things happening in front of me or whether it's going to exciting places like that was Machu Picchu. This is on Everest. I've done wildlife, but I've also done expedition filming. And it's very true to say that, you know, even when you go to the most remote parts of the world, civilization, as we call it, or waste will follow you there. I did not carry that Coke can. It was lying on the path as I made my way towards Everest. I just thought I would make a picture. And these days there is an enormous pressure on people, on places. People are travelling the world in greater numbers than ever before, and they're bringing enormous pressure onto those places. I mean, who would have thought, you know, that the top of Everest would have been like this one day in May 2019. The picture on the right-hand side shows the trail of climbers going from base camp at North Col up towards the next camp up. And this is the crowd of people waiting to get on the top. Now, I don't know, if I had been in that crowd of people going to the top, I wouldn't have thought that was a particularly worthwhile, satisfying experience. You might get to the top, but to do it in the company of 300 other people on the same day is not very great. And I think that lots of tourism organisations, what have you, will have to really look at the numbers of people that we're trying to invent, that we're trying to bring along, because greater numbers is not necessarily the best way to do. So I mentioned earlier on that I can watch an animal tearing another animal apart in a fairly detached manner if, as long as I'm watching, is a piece of natural behaviour which would have been happening was I not there. What really gets to me is when I see things like this, when I see animals suffering because of thoughtlessness on the part of humans. This would be quite funny, I think, if it wasn't true. you know. And there's no doubt that plastic waste in the ocean is a big problem. Now, I know that all you guys, what's good about talking to you people is that I don't need to dwell for a long time on the issues of plastics. You all know what the issues of plastics are, and you are all doing a very great part towards solving the problem. I just wish that we had seen the problem looming long before now, because it wasn't just that a David Attenborough program, you know, raised awareness from nothing. I know there was a lot of people working behind the scenes, but it does show you what someone like David with his clout and the outreach that a Blue Planet 2 program has. You can see the issues suddenly becomes forefront, and suddenly, hopefully, more money, more resources, more awareness make your job easier. I certainly hope it does, because we're all aware of dissecting seabirds and finding them full of plastic, the issue that turtles have, where, you know, turtles feed on jellyfish, and plastic floating in the ocean looks very like a jellyfish. We also know that plastics need to get redesigned so that they don't just break down into very small microplastics, but hopefully they just biodegrade completely into non-existent molecules, what have you, or into organic molecules. I notice, interesting, quite a lot of the Sunday newspapers are now wrapping their supplements in stuff which is basically potato starch. So you get this thing that looks like a plastic bag, but you can put it in your compost bin and it decomposes. Because microplastics are a big issue, it means that plastics become even more out of sight, but they're obviously still there. And when we put down plankton nets into the ocean and trawl them slowly through the ocean, they come up full of microplastics. And the closer we look, the more that we're seeing. You know, you take the very smallest animals in the ocean, the very bottom of the food chain, the plankton, you look at it and you can identify plastic pieces inside these tiny little animals. Inside fish larvae, we can see these little nurdles, which are the basis of a lot of plastic. The fish are ingesting them. Not just the small fish, but the bigger fish. You know, when you have manta rays, whale sharks, even baleen whales, which cruise around the ocean, lots of big animals feed on by filtering water, take the water in through their mouth, and filter out the food on modified gills, modified mouth parts. That's the tropical equivalent, the manta ray and the whale sharks, pardon me, in the tropics. But right within our own shores, we have basking sharks. We've got basking sharks going up the Clyde, going around the north-west coast of Scotland every year. And these guys feed on stuff that's so small you can't see, and they are bound to be ingesting particles of microplastics. One of the challenges is that we don't know what it's doing to the animals. We haven't really examined them enough. One of the issues when you put microplastics into the ocean, or when you have microplastics, is that there are some fairly toxic bacteria growing in the sea, floating around in the open water. And when you fill that open water with tiny particles of plastic, suddenly those microorganisms have a surface on which they can grow. And therefore, when it grows on the plastic and the plastic is ingested by an animal, the animal is taking in a far higher concentration of these nasty bugs and things than it would do by simply swimming through the open ocean. Again, we've got almost no idea what the long-term effects are. Very hard to study, but you can probably say that it's not very good. How do we get rid of microplastics that are there? Tough problem. I do not know, because the microplastics are everywhere. You know, we've been to the Antarctic, we've been to the Arctic, into the pack ice in the winter. Moor your ship up, get out in the pack ice, start digging into the snow, and we will find microplastics in that upper layer of sea ice which is formed that year. So the oceans do a very good job of distributing stuff. You put something in the ocean, washed down out the River Clyde or somewhere, for example, it can end up, because it lasts for hundreds of years, it can end up anywhere in the ocean. And there are big areas of concentration. KSB, Keep Scotland Beautiful, are doing a very good campaign called the Upstream Battle, where they're trying to clean up and trying to make a big awareness campaign to the River Clyde, because they know that a lot of ocean pollution starts in the rivers. Stuff gets washed down, storm drains, it gets carelessly discarded, it ends up in the river, it gets carried down to the ocean. So they have this upstream battle. And that's just one of many campaigns which are going on at the moment around UK. And I've got to say, Scotland, with its proposed deposit return scheme, things like that, Scotland is way ahead of England in this respect. They really have grasped the subject and they really have got it going. And I think, to be honest, without getting unduly patriotic or without offending any Sassenachs who are here, I think Scotland is ahead of the game in terms that it's more comfortably social. And by social, I mean people look after each other in Scotland. People are aware of the greater good that can be done by the community for the bigger community. There's just this greater awareness north of the border than somehow there is south. I know that's a sweeping generalisation, but it's one of the things that makes me proud to be Scottish. But what's happening in the ocean, and in fact around the world, the biggest issue that we have, the one that is bigger than any single conservation issue, is bigger than the plastic waste problem, is undoubtedly climate change. Climate change now is recognised as happening increasingly widely. There's a big awareness now, much greater awareness now than there was 5 years ago. And it echoes the kind of awareness that we had for conservation and what we were doing to the planet in some areas back in the late 60s, 70s. That was the last peak of conservation that I remember. I remember how optimistic everyone was in the early 70s that we were going to take big steps to stop overfishing, whaling. All these sort of big campaigns were going on then. We didn't see climate change back at that time. There were a few visionaries, maybe, but we certainly should have seen it since the last 20 to 30 years. In 1988, a guy called Jim Hansen stood up, said to the American Congress, we have a problem, we have a warming planet. Since the mid-50s, CO2 has been measured very, very accurately in 2 places on the world. The top of Mauna Loa, which is the top of Hawaii, and in the middle of the Antarctic at the South Pole. And the rise in CO2 levels has been inexorable, from around about 315 parts per million when they started in the mid-50s, up to now 400, 410. And I want to stop talking about climate change. I think we should all start talking about climate breakdown, because breakdown is a much more dangerous thing, a much more important thing to realise. You know, we change our clothes, we change our car, we change things. If you're in your car and it breaks down on the motorway, you are knackered till you fix it. A breakdown is much more emphatic than a simple change, and that's what we need to do. And let me take you to the Arctic, because that's where climate change is one of the most obvious things that's happening. It's where I've been working since the late 80s. And I got there at the end of the stable period. But we know from long-term measurements from submarines, which have been going underneath the Arctic ice, measuring the thickness of the ice, these classified secret expeditions, secret voyages have been made since the mid-60s, because at the height of the Cold War, the shortest distance to attack Russia from America was not across the Atlantic or even transport. It was to pop up through the ice right next to Russia, lob your missiles from there. So there's a lot of interest in what is the ice like in the Arctic during the winter? How thick is it? Where is it thickest? In the last 10 years, there were some very sophisticated satellites which also look down and measure the parameters of the ice. And what we know is that the Arctic ice, because basically the Arctic, the North Pole, is a frozen ocean surrounded by land. It's completely the opposite from the Antarctic. The Antarctic is a frozen continent surrounded by ocean. The Arctic is a frozen ocean surrounded by land. And we know that that Arctic Ocean is melting. If we look at the amount of ice that there is in the Arctic Ocean in the summer, we measure the minimum ice just about now, towards the tail end of September. That's when the sea ice cover is minimum. Back in 1984, you could look down, the North Pole's right in the middle where all those lines of longitude converge. You look down there, and the sea ice in the summer covered about 7.2 million square kilometres. And really, prior to 1984, that was pretty much the norm. It wasn't really changing much. Some years would be a little bit less, some years a little bit more. By 2012, however, we were down to almost half that area, 4.1 million square kilometres. That's about normal these years, but some years recover a little bit, some years will get less. But we're looking at a lot less sea ice in the Arctic. And the problem is that we're into what you'd call a positive feedback situation. The spring in the Arctic is becoming warmer every year, and that means warmer springs, therefore the sea ice is melting earlier. The sea ice melts earlier, the sea gets warmer over the summer, freezes later in the autumn, thinner ice in the winter, so break up earlier the following spring. So every year the spring ice is breaking up a bit sooner, the sea ice is freezing later. And that causes a problem for all the animals in the Arctic, but especially for polar bears. All the animals in the Arctic depend on that. All the marine animals depend on that sea ice being frozen. They depend on where it freezes, when it freezes, how much it freezes. Polar bears do it especially because polar bears are basically marine mammals. They're marine mammals like whales or seals or walrus. The difference between a whale and a polar bear is that a whale lives in the water and a polar bear lives on top of it. And when you take away that on top bit, you cause a problem for whales, for polar bears. Here is, hopefully, a polar bear hunting. Now that's how the ice should be in the spring. Nice and solid, lots of hunting area. The polar bear has to walk over a lot of ice to find the right seals. If the ice is broken up, then the polar bear can't cover the distance. It can't easily attack the seals. Basically in spring, instead of it being a peak time for hunting, it's a time of earlier starvation for the polar bears. So less of them are getting good hunting in the spring, and that means that more of them are dying through the summer. But more importantly, the cubs. When that female comes out of the den with her cubs, she's going down onto the sea ice, expecting to find good, solid sea ice to hunt for her cubs. If she can't feed the cubs don't last, the cubs don't survive. The first 6 months out of the den are a tough time for any cub, but for any bear. But when the sea ice isn't good, then they really, really have a tough time. There's another issue with climate change. CO2 is in balance with the CO2 in the water, has been for a long time. But as we increase the CO2 in the atmosphere, more of it dissolves into the sea. And that dissolving into the sea means that we're turning the sea more acidic. They're turning every sea in the world more acidic to a greater or lesser extent. The seas around UK are more acidic. What does that mean? That means for every animal that has a calcium carbonate shell, whether it's mussels, crabs, sea urchins, all those animals are going to have to spend more time, more energy building that calcium carbonate shell, because in an acidic environment, that calcium carbonate tends to dissolve. Right down at the bottom of the food chain are these tiny little microscopic copepods, dinoflagellates, what have you, animals with calcium carbonate shells. Those animals, those calcium carbonated shell animals, are eaten by things like sand eels, which in turn are eaten by puffins. Now, it means that if you have a plankton population which is less healthy than it should be because it's having to spend more energy just to maintain its shell, it doesn't have the same energy content that passes into the sand eels, that then passes to the puffins, that then passes to all the other animals on the cliff. So we've got a cascading problem from unhealthy plankton goes all the way right through up to less than healthy, less than ideal fish. less than healthy fish, less than healthy birds. So ocean acidification is another unseen and comparatively not unnoticed scientifically, but it certainly hasn't been fully addressed by people are to some extent unaware of it. But what we aren't unaware of is the huge effects of climate change. And particularly the Arctic. The Arctic weather controls the weather over a lot of the northern hemisphere. So a lot of the, hurricanes, the intensity of hurricanes is because of the temperature difference now between the sea and the atmosphere. That's what drives the intensity of a hurricane. So they're getting more intense because of climate change. Desertification is large-scale change in climate, which again we can relate sometimes to things happening in the Arctic. Flooding, coral bleaching, etc. All those things are happening, as we look around. And we know where the excess CO2, or where the big sources of CO2 are. So, from fossil fuel generation, fossil fuel burning in power stations, the way we burn it in cars, transport, flying generally, and meat consumption. Meat consumption is not so much CO2, but it's more land use and methane. Methane comes out of cows, and methane is a highly effective greenhouse gas. So we know where it's coming from, and we know what we should be doing about it. We should be going back to subsidising solar energy, wind power. We should all think about our flying that we're doing. Certainly should shift our diets towards less meat, what have you. More electric cars. There's a whole lot of stuff that we should be doing. And what I find odd, what I find really interesting, is that on the same BBC website page, on the same day, we can have that and we can have that. And this is our big problem, is that we need a different priority of economics. We need a different economic model to work to, such that we get away from this idea that somehow all of us spending less, consuming less, some of this idea that GDP, this great goal, somehow it's slowing down is something really bad. Because I think there will be a slowdown as we shift from one technology to another. I would urge you to read a book called Donut Economics. And this is Kate who wrote it. Now, Kate has this different system it's like an ecological economics. Because as she points out quite rightly, what she sees in the middle is all the things that should be people's right to have. The economics of a country should ensure that everyone has housing, energy, water, food, health, all those things in the middle. On the outside are the environmental limits that you mustn't go into. If you go into ocean acidification, ozone layer, air pollution, if we start to stray into those too far, then it's just, those are the truly limiting factors of growth. And here it is looking at it. When you look at it, the red ones are what we're overdoing. So already we know that biodiversity loss, land conversion, climate change are really big problems that the environment is pressing in on our economy. And all the red things you can see, we're almost shortfall on all the other red things in the middle. So what I think is we need a new economic model to work to. And what gets me is that there are examples in the past where when the money was needed, governments put stuff into it. Americans spent $750 billion to get out of the Depression. When they wanted the biggest, the most powerful bomb in history that would show everybody that they were the top dog after the First World War, $35 billion in 3 years turned a set of hypothetical equations into the biggest, most powerful weapon that we've ever had. It took them, when they decided to take on the Russians to get to the moon, 160 billion. 420,000 people were employed on the Apollo project at the peak of it. So it was great for employment and it had lots of spin-offs. But my point is that just for the sake of beating them, for the sake of national pride, they found 160 billion. And the biggest example of all, when the banks fell to pieces, what a great word, troubled asset relief program. Well, anyway, that was basically when the banks all screwed things up. We found $2 trillion in about a couple of years to bail them out. A temporary, in some cases, loan, a much longer loan, but the system was saved by the massive injection of money. So my question is, if we have the troubled asset relief program to bail out the banks, what about a troubled planet relief program, say that we did between now and 2030 to, stop the climate breakdown and recover, put big money into these big issues like plastic. I would say that's pretty priceless. If we can build the banks out for $2 trillion, then we should certainly be looking at massive money to save the planet. Massive money to go into the technologies. We have the technologies out there, which if they were brought in, they would need subsidized. If they were brought in, if the normal economic criteria were pushed to one side and the good of the planet was put to the front, then we would bring in carbon capture storage, which is where you suck out the CO2 at the point of emission and then you bury it back in the ground again. So you can do that. We can even have the technology to actually suck the carbon dioxide out of the air as it stands. And that's something that we'll need to do. CO2 levels are likely to stabilize at around about 450 parts per million. If we're going to seriously address climate change, we have to get that 450 down to 400 or even less, 350. That's going to take extraction from the air. The challenge is that in the air, it's much less concentrated. So we need to build big, banks like this. Now, if we can power those with renewable energy, then we can go somewhere, and we can do lots of things. We can build buildings which are much greener. We can definitely change lots of transport. There are lots of forms of transport that get used that would be ideal for electric vehicles, whether it's courtesy buses, airport hotel, whether it's taxis within cities. All those things should be given huge subsidies and help to, take the fossil fuels off the road. Scotland and the UK has got enormous reserves of hydropower, which are beginning to get used, or which have been used, but which could be made more efficient. Wind and solar are really effective ways, particularly solar. Solar is an interesting. I think solar has probably got the biggest potential for increased efficiency, not just at the level of individual buildings, but in huge solar arrays. I was talking to somebody the other day. This is a system in Morocco. You basically have got a circle of reflective mirrors all concentrating on that centre tower. And in that centre tower, you can generate 900 degrees centigrade temperature, and that melts this very pure salt, which is in this tower. Top of the tower, there is pure salt. And that pure salt you can liquidize at 900 degrees centigrade. You can use the heat from the salt to drive steam turbines to produce your electricity. In the night, when the sun goes down, the salt still retains enough energy, enough heat in it to carry on driving those turbines. With new increases in efficiency of transmission, new alloys that are getting used to transmit electricity along cables, we don't have the big voltage drop that we used to have. So we could produce an energy internet around the world. We could have a system of some very high-intensity areas around the world's deserts which would generate the electricity which we could send thousands of kilometres to where it's needed. All that sort of stuff is there. It just needs the impetus. It just needs the financial backing to get it going, I think, because it's really clear what needs to be done. It's pretty simple. I think we've got to reduce the carbon footprint of people around the world, and then we stand the best chance of saving what we've got of the planet. Not the best chance. In fact, it's the only chance, because we ran out of lots of options. It's a little bit like Brexit, We've pissed away a whole, 3 years not going very far. Well, we've basically pissed away the last 30-odd years. More CO2 went into the world in 2018 than any previous year. So all the treaties, whatever you take it, more CO2 went in last year than any previous year. So we really haven't even begun to dent the problem. And, if you take, plastic litter and then, CO2, however, take those two as being two big issues. I remember what Mark Twain said. I read this when I was at university, and it kind of took my life in a different direction. He said, 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did. And I took that to mean that, you're going to try things, you'll be disappointed, but the biggest disappointment will be if you never tried them in the first place. Well, let me modify what he said. I think 20 years from now, we will be totally screwed by the things we didn't do. We'll have to act now when we know we should. It's no use saying in 20 years, I wish we'd done so-and-so. We've really got to come, better. Now, I believe that human beings are basically good people. I've travelled around, and the number of truly evil characters that I've met are few and far between. Most people, by default, are good people. But the problem is that humans are almost too human for their own good. We live in a society that we've created, an enormously complicated society, but it has suited us. But what we need to do now is we need to take our place which is all kind of assumed to be at the top of some kind of chain. We need to take our place and realise that we have to be part of that environment. We're part of the planet. For too long we've lived off it. We now need to live with it. We need to live within it. We need to have different priorities. And if that means a different economics, a different way of running things, that's what we need to do. And that's the biggest challenge, is taking basic human nature somehow and moving it, shifting its goalposts. Shifting its goalposts. We need to listen to the people in Extinction Rebellion. We need to listen to all the positive people. And we need a massive change of difference of attitude from government. We all want to say that we want to look after the planet. Well, there's a penguin that should reach out to you, and you think, you know, we need the natural world too. Just as much as the natural world needs us, we need the natural world, because we've only got one natural world to live on, haven't we? Despite what Elon Musk says, you know, we're not all going to go to Mars. We're going to have to live on the planet that we've got. And it's only, I think, by being passionate, imaginative, engaged and connected, only then will we end up with a sustainable, regenerative, profitable economy. And the challenge is the speed that we need to move it fast. But we've got to remember, I will remember what Gene Kranz said. He was the flight director of Apollo 13. When they nearly lost that mission, he got his guys together and he said, gentlemen, failure, he said, gentlemen, failure is not an option. Now I've lost my place. He said, failure is not an option. And that's the sort of attitude that we need, you know, for the planet. Like I say, we've got to all get more engaged with it. We've got to get people engaged at primary school level and take it all the way up through so that we end up in a different place. But the problem is we haven't got time to do that. I mean, I'm sure the next generation will grow up differently, but it's us, the people who are that bit older, we're the ones who have to decide where we're going to put our X on the next voting chance, what we're going to make our priorities, because failure is not an option with this lot. So all I would say is that if failure is not an option, I would ask, so when are we going to start? Because like I say, more CO2 went into the atmosphere last time than any other time. And I think, when are we going to start? The time to start is now. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much, Doug. Do come and
yes, sir.
Do come in and join us across here. We've been getting lots of questions in via the app, but also please feel free to go about things in the old-fashioned way and just raise a hand. We've got a couple of roving mics.
Can we bring the lights up in the auditorium, please, so we can see the audience?
We've heard lots of things this morning. Disturbing, alarming, as somebody said here. An amazing presentation, Doug, and also Mike. Lots of questions here for you. So let's work our way through some of these now. Mike, I'll let you get your breath for a bit. What can we do as UK waste professionals to improve environmental standards in low and middle income nations? What can we do from here for there?
Number one, support WasteAid. Yes. Secondly,
support
WasteAid. So get involved.
Yes, but how? Through corporate social responsibility? Or,
absolutely.
Or
I mean, just we only exist because we have volunteers all over the UK advocating for what we do, advocating for the importance of international waste. So getting out there, talking to schools and other universities, getting out there and talking to non-specialists, saying this stuff matters. I think as waste managers, sometimes we're a bit modest. People only notice what we do by its absence. They think those clean streets just kind of happen. The thing I always remember is that I think a few years ago, Keep Britain Tidy with some of the Royal Parks in London, they just did. They had a couple of days where they actually didn't litter pick and they didn't empty the bins just for a day in Hyde Park, these sort of places. And, you know, they looked like an absolute, war zone, frankly. And people just think this stuff disappears and it goes away and it just happens. Well, unless you know you've got teams there 24/7 working through the night, working in all weathers, making sure this material is taken away, it's either contained, it's valorized wherever possible. So yeah, we've got to get better at talking about what we do. One of the things that WasteAid has found itself doing, we're actually developing an online course. We've got a community toolkit, and we've had 100,000 odd downloads. There's a massive demand for this stuff around the world. But actually with Biffa, shout out to Biffa who's been supporting us, we're developing an online course that's going to be based on the toolkit. Why? Because a lot of the people that we work with, they say, look, everyone thinks I'm crazy for working with waste. They're like, why do you want to deal with rubbish? You know, why do you want to do something so dirty and disgusting? People, they're looked down upon. So the least that we can do is create, you know, just a course so they can say, look, I've actually got a certificate in this, I know what I'm talking about. So they can go to their local government, they can go to their local council, they can talk to people in their local community and say, I know what I'm talking about, and actually this stuff matters. So, yeah, be proud, talk about what we do. In terms of international, I think it's very important that we start looking at where our waste goes. I mean, it's very interesting, I think, you know, seeing with what's happened with China and the kind of the lack of countries accepting waste. You know, that move to start kind of essentially onshoring our waste reprocessing capacity.
And it is
That's good.
Somebody's asking here, how often is foreign waste the problem in the places you've shown us rather than local waste?
And it's generally local waste. I mean, there's material that's imported, but that's you know, those bottles are imported as preformed bottles and often made within the, you know, made into big bottles in the local market. Essentially, in most of the places we deal with, it's the domestically produced waste, and that I think is a lot of, you know. So lives have changed. More people are living in towns and cities than ever before. The way that people live their lives is now, rather than living a subsistence lifestyle on a farm, perhaps as generations did 50 or 60 years ago, more people in the world are now living a consumer lifestyle. They, you know, might be working in a shop or a factory. They go to the market, they buy their rice or cassava or potatoes or what have you. That comes in a bag. What happens to that bag? Life has changed. So there's a lot of domestically produced waste, and frankly, that's what we focus on most of the time.
Come to you in a moment, Doug, but Joe Farrell, Mike, is asking, are there any examples you can share of tourist destinations, and perhaps you too, Doug, which balance access to spectacular natural environments while providing the necessary safeguards?
I mean, Costa Rica is very well known for living within its ecological boundaries, if that's the right phrase, and
I think Bhutan is the same.
And Bhutan as well. Fantastic, yeah, Doug, if you've got.
Yeah, I mean, this is becoming, you know, Venice, for example, you know, is about to limit its tourist numbers because they just cannot handle that number of people, you know, going down there. And it's going to be something that is going to become increasingly that developing countries are developing, you know, for their tourism in this country, etc. I mean, look at Skye, for example. You know, Skye, there was a big issue last year when, you know, 1,500 people on a tour ship would turn up on one day, and all of them wanted to go to the Fairy Glen and all of them, etc. And it was a big problem. They actually were destroying the very thing that they had come to see. So it's something we have to look at, and it's also, tourism has a big infrastructure that it carries with it. And it's one of the big issues is how to handle the numbers, but handle it in a green, sensible, sustainable way.
How much hope do you have, Doug, it's asked here, that human civilization can reverse the trends of consumption and waste that have caused so much of the problems you've identified?
You know, you have to be realistic. And the fact is, if we carry on as we are, we will lose things. I cannot understand how people in government, how even the Committee on Climate Change, which exists in this country, which is sort of appraises the government every couple of years on what they've done, have they reached their targets and things. When you read their latest report, which came out in June, July, it actually talks in a kind of matter-of-fact way, although it doesn't want it to happen, about how will we cope with 3 or 4 degrees temperature rise. If we have 3 or 4 degrees temperature rise across the globe, the world as we know it will basically not exist. You know, there will be pockets of humanity, there will be pockets of humans, but the borders where we grow our plant, where we grow our food, everything will, the natural world, all these ecosystems that we depend on will not be there. So we need huge action. We need it quickly. We need it fast. That is the one thing that's going to do.
How do you get that message?
How do we get that
another
message?
question to people
I would like to think
who don't get it.
Well, I'd like to think that we get that message with as much outreach efforts as we can in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of media. David Attenborough is speaking up about it. I think we have to remind people that they have a lot of power in their finger when they put the X opposite the cross. When the next general election comes in this country, decide that your vote will go to the person with the greenest agenda, the person who puts those sort of things at the top. I'm urging the BBC Natural History Unit to have a debate, a purely environmental debate with, is it just like the debates that we will have televised, for the general stuff? Let's have one about the environment. Let's see what people plan to do.
And what about resource management professionals here and others who clearly are entirely bought into the message and what you're saying? What is it that you ask of them?
Well, I would just ask them, them to as big corporations or as smaller businesses, make sure that your MP realises what the issues that you would like, which can include subsidies, a regeneration of economic assets, what have you, so that we can make the changes that we need quicker, whether it's more into R&D to develop new kinds of plastics, which will biodegrade, etc. I mean, you're the guys who know the problems. You have to bring those problems to bear and tell, and just get the message out. And we all have to realise that business as normal, business as usual, will not work. Now, it's a massive ask. There has been nothing like this ever asked of the planet before. Never before has this all-enveloping issue been so right in our face. But I do believe that it's one that needs to be grasped. Whether we will get back the Arctic, whether we will have an Arctic in 30 years' time, like we have in Africa now. We have an Africa which is a tiny vestige, or a North America, which is a tiny vestige of wild animals live in North America compared to 300 or 400 years ago. Human beings, the Europeans arrived and they just changed the whole ecology. We've got wonderful places like Yellowstone, the national parks, but in terms of the area, in terms of the plains, the animals just aren't there. Now, will the Arctic be like that? Will there be a few pockets where the ice still somehow manages to last for enough of a year that polar bears can make a living? I don't know.
But as Jim Brown says here, climate breakdown, it all seems a bit overwhelming to the general public. And I mean, I can ask this of you too, Mike. How do we communicate the message and make it easy for people to do their bit? And people often feel that there's very little individually that they can do.
I disagree. What we should all bear in mind is that if we did everything that would counteract climate change, life would be better. If we all if we had big subsidy electric vehicles and things, think how much cleaner the air would be in our cities. Think how much healthier we would live. A whole lot of those things.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of things that come through strongly. I sometimes feel like within the environmental sector, we've almost missed a trick of saying it's actually about environmentalism. It's not. It's about survival for humanity. This is essentially a deeply anthropogenic approach. We need, and we need the planet to be existing within certain parameters so we in our society can flourish. The planet doesn't have morals. It'll get warmer, it'll get cooler, different, frankly, if we're there or not, it doesn't care.
But how can you say it's about quality of life when actually it is easier to get into your petrol car knowing that you will safely get 300 miles without breaking down without a charge?
That's only today. That's only today. If the move went to electric cars, then the technology, would follow. And besides, yes, it'll take a long time. It could take a long time to have as many electric recharging points as there are petrol stations up the motorway, but it could happen remarkably quickly.
And, I think it's about leadership. I mean, I see within the waste and resources sector, the schemes that work really well, the stuff that makes change happen is when government particularly is clear about, look, well, this is what we need to do and this is where we're going to go and we're going to get on with it. Seeing how Scotland and Wales within this island, how Scotland and Wales have led the debate, and England, frankly, is it's all at sixes and sevens. And it's because there is clear leadership here. People know what they want to do and know what they want to go, and they're not frightened to say to the public, actually, this is what you need to do. As long as you've done your homework and you know how to run a scheme or make sure that it's going to work. Be brave. And I see it, having originally come from, the municipal sector, just, essentially encouraging people to, recycle more and dishing out recycling boxes, is when you're clear and you say, no, I know it's change, I know it's difficult, I know you're going to complain, I know the Daily Mail and the media is going to have a crack, but be clear, be brave and confident about what you're saying. Mm-hmm. We need to do it. Get over it. I mean,
does that include, sorry, just to interrupt you with another question, does that include taxes, for instance? Governments need to provide far more money to tackle climate breakdown, it's being said, but is this enough? Is it not also vital that we radically alter policies and make carbon taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. I know. Just on a slight aside, anyone, okay, I might be generalising for us all in the room, but people who work in the sector generally think pay as you throw is a good idea. It's a largely well-accepted issue. We know that the politicians aren't quite ready for it yet, but getting the taxes and the incentives right. I mean, what I was saying up there, at the moment we have a system where, with a lot of single-use plastics, essentially, the management is outsourced to the public sector. You're expected to deal with that. And what we're seeing in those pictures I put up there is what happens when there isn't a public sector, when there isn't collection. So actually the private sector need to say, okay, we'll set up a system where we're going to take that material, however they do it, whether it's deposit returns, whether it's some kind of buyback system, what have you. But you just need to set up your incentives right, and actually as professionals, say, look, we know this stuff works. Pay as you throw, the evidence is clear. If we want to reach those next levels, we've got to go for it. There might be elements of the public. I'm sure the public whinge. That's what they do. There'll be elements of the press. Who'll have a crack. But once you do it, and as long as you're confident, you do it clearly and do it consistently, it will be fine. You look at. All of the other big behaviour change things, seatbelts and driving. People, there were all these complaints, all these people saying, "Oh, you're playing, it's freedom." It's nonsense. Smoking inside. 30 years ago, this room probably would have been full of smoke. It's not now. People get over it, move on. Just make the decision, be clear about what you do, be confident, and crack on.
And there are there are examples of countries around the world which have done much better, become much greener, recycling, etc., is different from how they do it here. There are lots of different systems that you can look at, and you have to decide which one is appropriate. And that, I think, is one of the advantages that Scotland has with her autonomous parliament, is that a country with the resources of Scotland and a 5 million population can approach this issue of climate change, subsidies for all the good things, etc., in a really different way from the 55 million who live in England.
On which point, somebody says we know policy and legislation is not a silver bullet. However, if you could both pass a piece of legislation tomorrow, what would it be? One piece of legislation that you could pass tomorrow, even faster than the Ben bill.
Well, I would return all the subsidies for solar panels on roofs, for example, which disappeared, which caused a huge, people took it up and they put on solar panels, and then the government took it off and suddenly they became expensive and people dropped off. But that's the sort of thing we could go back to, and that's the sort of thing we should be encouraging. People put up your own panels on the roof and sell your excess back to the grid. That sort of thing.
Good. Yours?
Within the UK, give local authorities freedom on how they charge for waste. Let them decide. They can all argue it out in the council chambers. If you want to have similar systems to now, if you want to have pay as you throw, go for it. Local democracy.
Okay, here's a question for you. Should it be illegal to ship our waste abroad to countries that are struggling to deal with their own waste?
We live in a globalised world. If you're buying, I'm being very simplistic, but if you're buying stuff made out of plastic from China, that is where the demand for that secondary material is going to be. However, given that, it's important to ensure that we are clear about what is happening with that material. So, it's great to onshore reprocessing, but yeah, we live in a globalised world, and you've got these flows of material going one way, you're going to have it going the other way. So, yeah, understand what's happening to it, and don't just think it's an opportunity to kind of wash your hands off it. But, you know, as I said, this material, if you're going to be buying things from overseas, that's where the demand for the material, for the secondary material, and that's what we're doing when we're collecting recycling. It's essentially harvesting secondary materials. That's where the demand's going to be.
Okay, the effects of climate change, climate breakdown, Doug. I mean, this is along the lines of what you've been talking about, but the suggestion that they do feel quite distant to Scots. Droughts in Australia, melting polar ice. What ideas do you have to make this more connected to Scots?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was an article that said if you want to avoid the worst effects of climate change, live between 45 and 55 degrees north, because they reckon that those latitudes will be affected in a way least. So the big key places to go are UK, to some extent, New Zealand, a good place to go, because those places already get quite a variable climate in a way, and also they're surrounded by water.
But Scots just end up saying, this is a nice hot day we're having for a change. You know?
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, it's what was the question? What would I...
Well, how do you make it more sort of...
How do you make it more
real to Scots who are not seeing, by and large, the extremes that are being seen in other parts of the world?
Well, I think you might talk to farmers, you might talk to people who work on the land, you might talk to people, you know, within the RSPB, for example, and they would tell you quite scary things about the natural world as it's happening with them, the bird populations, the seabird populations, etc., around UK. You might, it doesn't happen so much here, but for example, in the Somerset Levels, where we've had in certain parts of England, even this weekend, we're getting a different pattern of rainfall, which is leading to more flash flooding, more flooding. Now, you try selling your house after it's been flooded, and after the predictions are that, well, this kind of thing's maybe going to happen, you know, 2 or 3 times in the next 20 years, you know, you won't sell it. So things like that, I think if we made maybe more awareness of public about the changing patterns of weather and rainfall, such that these climate change things that we associate with Bangladesh, what have you, with their huge floods, these things are going to become more common around UK unless we get the infrastructure rebuilt to handle this different density of rainfall.
I mean, yeah, there's a certain irony. Essentially, this is where it all started, isn't it? The UK is the country that started the Industrial Revolution, started burning all these fossil fuels, and if they're kind of going to get away with it, I think there's an interesting opportunity to learn actually from, you know, the Blue Planet effect. I mean, that's really increased awareness around the whole issue of plastics, and actually from WasteAid's point of view, I mean, it's been transformative. People kind of get now that there's a lot of people in the world who don't have their rubbish collected, a lot of it ends up in the sea. We've all seen Blue Planet, that's a bad thing. And if there's, I don't know, just a tangible way of really putting your finger on it, what climate change is going to mean. I mean, there was the impact polar bears and so forth that can really catalyse
there's at least one series being done on British wildlife, and it's an idea. You just given me an idea to go along at this stage, because the series is still in development, but it would be an idea to look at, you know, UK as it is, and then have one programme about, if things continue, what's UK going to be like for the people and for the animals?
Is that a bit depressing that people are more concerned by and large about what happens to polar bears and seals than people in Bangladesh who are being flooded out of their homes? And
this is partly what I mean when I say human nature is, you know, we're butting up against the edges of human nature and what people are prepared to do. I sometimes look at Greta Thunberg, that young Swedish woman who got very, very upset, you know, at the UN giving her talk the other day. And I wondered, Greta, if supposing you'd been born 20 years ago, would you be as upset as, you know, at the famines in Africa, Ethiopia, for example? You know, are you the kind of person that gets very upset? And if so, we must be very careful not to overburden that young woman with such a big problem. Because if there is a solution to climate change, and I think there are solutions, but we also have to recognise that we are committed to 1.5 degrees centigrade. 1.5 degrees centigrade will happen even if all the CO2 emissions into the world stopped tomorrow, because changes lag behind the CO2. Temperature rises lag behind the CO2 rise. When you do the mathematics on 420 that we've got, we will have 1.5. We've seen what happens with 1 degree centigrade. I believe that we have possibly passed a tipping point with extreme weather. And it started last year. 2018, the typhoons, the hurricanes around the world were more intense, there were more of them. I don't see anything to change that view this year. Now, there are other tipping points sitting out there, other things that, as we increase the CO2, one of the big ones in the Arctic, for example, is methane. You know, the methane is a highly, highly effective greenhouse gas. The same amount of methane, you need 20 times as much CO2 to produce the same amount of climate change, of warming. Now, there are enormous amounts of methane locked up in the permafrost of the Arctic and in a crystalline form underneath the Arctic Ocean, where it's kept in crystalline form by the fact that the water's cold and it's sort of 600-800 feet deep. Now, that Arctic Ocean is warming, especially across continental shelves. The top surface is warming and that warmth is creeping down, and the methane is starting to dissolve underwater. Now, if we get a big methane hiccup from increasing amounts from the ocean, from melting of permafrost, then we will see a kick in the climate, a kick in the temperature. That kick in the temperature will produce other turnaround effects. Now, we don't know what tipping points we're going to pass between now and 1.5, but we will have to cope with 1.5. Many of the...
I hate to close you down on a slightly
no, I'm
depressing
sorry,
note,
I'd like to...
but
no,
I just want to give, because we're running out of time, I want to give a final word to Mike. And there's a lot of questions here, actually, in various forms about multinational producers and their responsibilities, and you know, whether you should be getting multinational producers not to supply products and packaging that, when it comes to waste, just cannot be handled in other countries.
Sure, I mean,
what needs to be done there?
Yeah, there has been a massive shift to single-use packaging and the sachet economy, as you call it. I mean, I was in Nigeria last year doing some training. I just went into a shop next door, and you can buy everything in sachets. You can buy little powdered milk. You can buy breakfast cereals, even toothpaste, deodorant, random stuff that you can't get here. And the argument is great. It's a cheap way of getting product to people who couldn't afford it otherwise. But what happens to these tiny little sachets, which are tricky enough to recycle here? For a start, I think, yeah, they need to be looking at systems to collecting the material that they're putting into a system. You know, here it essentially just provides a kind of burden to the public sector. There's a cost to the taxpayer to collect it, incinerate it, recycle it, what have you. Parts of the world where there's no waste collection, it just ends up in the rivers, it ends up being burnt, it ends up being dumped. And I think multinationals should see it as a business issue, because I can tell you, the grassroots populations, people are getting fed up of drowning in their own rubbish. They really are getting sick of it. I mean, in Kinshasa last year, for instance, there were floods, people sadly died, a dozen people sadly died. This was in January 2018. There was a cholera outbreak. Médecins Sans Frontières had a field hospital 20 minutes down the road from where I was working. And, you know, people were saying this is because the drains aren't being emptied. And the government was actually saying, oh, it's climate change. It's terribly sad. All these floods, we never used to have them. People saying, look, we always had floods. It rains all the time here. It's just the drains weren't all blocked with plastic. And I think, you know, multinationals need to see that it is a business risk to them, because, you know, you can tell the branding from those bottles that were sitting, those pictures I was up there. You know, when you see it, I've never seen a ton of carbon. You can't see where a ton of carbon is coming from. You can blame it on one organisation or another, and another organisation can say, well, we're doing lots. But, you know, if you're putting rubbish into a system where it's not going to get collected, your name is on the front of it, okay? So you need to see it as a business risk, and you need to start thinking, okay, how am I going to capture that stuff? Secondly, it's not just the multinationals also. We think you know, that all of these companies are European or US based. There's a lot of medium-sized companies from places like Indonesia that are selling noodles into Africa, for instance. So, yeah, the world is a much bigger and kind of multifarious place. So, yeah, they do need to be starting thinking about it. It's not just about CSR, it's about ensuring that they don't end up getting banned from there, because places like, you know, Kenya's banned plastic bags, they're getting a taste for it. They're looking at plastic bottles next. And I'm not saying actually that's a particularly, you know, optimum way of dealing with packaging, because there's a need for this stuff. And for instance, you know, particularly where there's not potable water, you need somehow to get drinking water to people. But the government often think, okay, this is going to be a quick win, populist, great, bang, I'm just going to ban that. And that's going to be a bad outcome, perhaps for lots of people, not least the companies that are selling stuff in there. So they need to start taking action, and start taking action that actually makes a difference. And unfortunately, with waste, you can see it, right? So if your system, if your newfangled recycling system that you're promoting or your collection system isn't working and essentially it's just greenwash, you'll be able to see it because the rivers will still be full of plastic with your name all over it. So.
Mike, thank you very much for that. Thank you, both of you, for, wow, I mean, a fascinating session, and what a lot we've got to think about. But thank you very much both for outlining the problems and for also giving us a sense of the fact that things can be done if there is the will. Mike Webster and Doug Allan, thank you very much indeed. And do feed in your thoughts and your insights about what we've heard there to the workshop sessions, the first of which are coming up just after the break. That break is coming now, and can I remind you, while you're clutching your coffee, to go around and have a look at the exhibitors who are so important in supporting this event. The workshop sessions will begin at 11:30, and locations for each session can be found on the notice boards in the foyer area or on your app. That's all from me today. I hope very much you enjoy the rest of the conference. And Doug's got his hand up there because he is going to be selling and signing books out there. So if you're interested in hearing the further thoughts of Doug Allan, do go and see him at the book signing area. But for now, enjoy your break. Bye-bye.